Now, let's remember our theme here that meaning and interpretation actually profoundly shapes the future, right? Future history, if you will. And let's return to the Emancipation Proclamation. I just mentioned that it was passed in 1863. And here's the thing, was Lincoln moved by moral reasons or political reasons to pass the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863? Okay, was he moved to eradicate something that was, completely immoral, or was it more political? Right. Well, the answer to that, according to historians, is that Lincoln was moved primarily by political reasons. Okay, how does this work? Well, let's remember that before the war, cotton was, cotton exports. Well, this is what the Southern economy depended upon, right? And Lincoln knew that, and certainly the South knew that if this was in some way affected, it would be devastating to the South. Now, here's the thing, by 1863, the Civil War by this point was a war of attrition, meaning that, there's no clear side that was winning the war. At the same time, you have casualties mounting. And also, let's think about the Southern trade with foreign countries. There were other countries in Europe specifically who depended on Southern cotton. And when the war broke out in 1861, they were, if you will, observing at the sidelines, watching interestedly of how this was going to unfold. And indeed, by 1862, because of their dependency on Southern cotton, some of these countries were poised to negotiate with the South in order to resume their cotton trade with the Confederate South. Now, Lincoln, of course, got word of this, and he recognized the political and economic repercussions, right? First of all, it would pretty much inject the Southern economy with this important revenue, right, garnered from the cotton trade. And second, perhaps even more vital, is this political dimension. If trade was resumed with some European countries, those countries would have to recognize the South as a sovereign nation, right? So this would be devastating, right? Let's remember, Lincoln never acknowledged the Confederate South as a sovereign nation. If these European countries who were interested in resuming trade actually did so, well, it wouldn't be in favor of the South, and less so to the North. So what Lincoln did is pass the Emancipation Proclamation to stave off the possibility of this happening. How does this work? Okay, well, you have to remember here that slavery was already outlawed in almost all of Europe. The only remaining place in Europe that practiced slavery, and it would soon be abolished in the late 1860s, was Russia, where they had a form of serfdom, right? But everywhere else, slavery was abolished, and largely due to moral reasons, right? It was deemed to be an immoral institution. Now, if Lincoln passes the Emancipation Proclamation, interestingly enough, this would alter the, quote, meaning of the Civil War. Sure, at first it's a political conflict, right, based on secession being unconstitutional. But if you pass the Emancipation Proclamation, this redefines the war as a moral conflict. Right? Now that you pass the Emancipation Proclamation, you recast the meaning of the war as this moral crusade to free slaves in the South, right? And again, that's completely moral. So here you can see the significance of meaning and interpretation, hopefully, right? How the interpretation of the war changes from initially at least a political conflict to that of a moral conflict, right? And historians point out that Lincoln was moved by political reasons, that is to say, this, to prevent recognition of the South, right? And to prevent a resumption of cotton trade, which is, again, economic. He was moved by political and economic reasons to pass the Emancipation Proclamation, but he also knew that it would change the complexion of the war to become a moral conflict, right? So again, the war changes meaning to become a moral conflict. So this is really a masterstroke of political genius, on the part of Lincoln. Right? What this does is, not only prevent European trade, but also, redefine the conflict as a moral one. And how does this fit in with European countries that want to resume trade? Well, the European countries, which, let me remind you, outlawed slavery, it would look bad if they chose the wrong side. Because now they're faced with, a moral issue rather than an economic one, right? Should they choose the morally correct side or the morally incorrect side? So even European countries were forced to reinterpret the meaning of the war, right, as a moral crusade to eliminate slavery. Right? So again, we see how meaning and interpretation figures prominently in how the conflict will unfold. Now, let's circle back to this issue. How did African American slaves interpret the meaning of the war? And for this, we have to go back to Stephen Hahn, right? What Lincoln meant to the slaves. And what was the main argument of that article, by the way? Hopefully you discerned the main point that Hahn was making. And, it was basically that African American slaves were interpreting this political struggle, right, as all about their freedom, African American freedom. That the reason for war from the very beginning, and the reason for sexual conflict even before 1861, was to free the slaves. That the war was all about them, so to say. And notice, of course, that this is moral, the elimination of slavery due to its obvious immorality. Yet, even Stephen Hahn mentions this in his article. This was a drastic misinterpretation, at first at least, right? This was not the reason in the beginning for the sexual conflict leading to war. Also, notice this meaning does not comport with Lincoln's interpretation, as we now know. Lincoln is entirely political. That is, the North felt it was unconstitutional for the South to leave the Union to secede, and therefore war is a necessary measure to reconstitute the country. So, the slaves' meaning and Lincoln's meaning of the conflict, they actually diverge. One is moral, the other is political. And by the way, this brings us back to the Emancipation Proclamation. Did the Emancipation Proclamation actually free the slaves when it was issued in 1863? Well, the answer is no. Okay? Think about it. Is the South, the Confederate South, going to abide by Lincoln's decree? Right? The South will say, "You're not my president, Mr. Lincoln." Right? They had their own president, Jefferson Davis. Now, it did free a few thousand slaves in the border states like Maryland and say West Virginia and so forth. But for the most part, there were, you're talking about nearly 4 million slaves. They remained slaves despite the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. It was only by Northern victory and Southern defeat that slavery would be eliminated, in other words. Okay. And in fact, the Emancipation Proclamation actually obscures or shrouds the role that African Americans played in freeing themselves. Okay? Now, when I say in freeing themselves, I don't simply mean running away from the plantation, following the North Star, reaching the Underground Railroad and escaping to the north. That's not what I mean. Okay, what I'm arguing is something more significant than that. When I say free themselves, I'm saying this, that African Americans played a crucial and pivotal role in dismantling the institution of slavery altogether. Okay, in 1863, with the Emancipation Proclamation, as mentioned, it was not the case that slavery was dismantled, right? It was just a decree at that point in time in 1863. In actual truth, African Americans played a decisive role here. Now, how could this be? And this seems counterintuitive to most of you listening, right? Well, for this, we need to discuss this philosophical doctrine, really, referred to as agency in the slide. Okay. And what is agency? Agency refers to the capacity, the ability of individuals, or perhaps even a group of people, right, to shape their life course, right? In other words, people, by the way, it assumes the existence of free will. So a person has free will. They have the ability to act or behave based on that decision making, right? And therefore they, in many ways, shape or influence the trajectory of their own lives. Okay, so that's agency. Now, the central notion here is free will, right? But slaves, even by definition, have no free will, right? They are literally chained around their wrists, around their ankles. Therefore, do slaves possess agency? And that's why I put a question mark here, right? It seems impossible. Yet, actually, as I just mentioned earlier, right, the slaves freeing themselves, African American slave agency actually contributed crucially to the war ending with Northern victory. And again, this could be a head scratcher for some. How could this be? So let me lay out the contour of the argument in the next slide.